All right. Well, welcome to our community lunch and learn, everyone. I'm Jillian Graber, Executive Director of Protect PT, and we have two very great guests today about a very timely subject. Within the community work that we're doing, as well as other folks around the region, and I am joined by Dr. Walter Tsou. He's on the board of directors for Physicians for Social Responsibility Pennsylvania, and he's an adjunct professor at the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health, University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine, and he was the past president of the American Public Health Association and former health commissioner in Philadelphia. Welcome, Dr. Tsou. And we also have Amy Mall. She is with NRDC, so she's the senior advocate for their Dirty Energy Land Division Nature Program at the National Resource Defense Council. And so she's worked for NRDC Land and Wildlife Program, helping to shape policy to protect natural resources and communities from harmful oil and gas development and other industry impacts. In recent years, her efforts have focused on strengthening regulation regarding fracking oil and gas waste management and pipelines. A graduate of Cornell and Harvard University's, she holds a master's degree in public policy. So thank you so much to highly educated and really wonderful guests today. And I apologize in advance for my dog barking in the background. I'm not sure how you can hear that, but he is barking quite extensively. And so we're going to start with talking about this really important report that just came out about fracking and forever chemicals. And so we're going to start with you, Dr. Tsou, and talking about the report that was released. We're going to go ahead and put the link to the report in the chat because it's not up on our screen. And so folks can learn more about that report and read it for themselves. But this report was just released, last week or the week before, really recently. And so I wanted to just really quickly go through the report and see if there are things that you really want to point out about this report, Dr. Tsou.
Well, thank you so much, Jillian, for the invitation to come. This is actually an interesting report because we have known for a long time that there are literally hundreds of different chemicals used in the fracking process. And once those chemicals are introduced into water, it renders that water permanently unusable, and it removes it from the water cycle. And we're not talking about a small number. We're talking for every fracked well, somewhere between 4 to 14 or 15 million gallons of water that is permanently contaminated. Some of those chemicals, or many of those chemicals, are actually revealed in a frac focus database. But the industry has always maintained that there are some chemicals that are proprietary that cannot be revealed because they're trade secrets. And we've always suspected perhaps that some of these trade secrets maybe is because these chemicals are things that they really don't want public attention to. And among the ones that I think would be of great concern to the public would be PFAS, or these per or polyfluoroalkyl compounds or substrates that are used in a whole variety of processes. It is, yes, on nonstick pans, but it's also used in firefighting. It's used in sort of Scotch guard weather proofing for water resistance. And these chemicals actually have now been discovered in drinking water, and they have been linked to a whole variety of health problems, including cancer, liver toxicity, endocrine disruption, preeclampsia, which is a condition in pregnancy, and a whole host of other things which have yet to be fully explored, but enough to know that you don't really want these chemicals in your drinking water. And they're also called forever chemicals because uh, unlike things that are compostable and that will eventually break down and return to the environment, these chemicals never break down. They reside in the environment forever, and they maintain their toxicity forever, including the toxicity to the water that was contaminated during the fracking process and the possible seepage of that water into the groundwater and drinking water of our communities. And all that, I think, raises a lot of questions about why fracking, we think, cannot be done safely in this country.
Yeah, and so I thought it was interesting when I was reading through the report and listening to some stuff that you guys put out about the report where, these are, and correct me if I'm wrong. So these are chemicals that have been disclosed by the industry that they are using, and you can learn about this through Frac Focus. And I believe that Mary could probably put that up in the chat for folks on YouTube to learn more about Frac Focus. But, these are industry reported chemicals. And so from what I understand, Physicians for Social Responsibility, who wrote the report, they went and looked at the chemicals that are being used by different companies, right? And so there were, and I think this is on the next slide, there are different, yes, so there are different chemicals that are listed and by company here, and so that's how this information was gathered. So I think it's interesting that this is industry data. This is not data from from DEP reports. This is not data from that you guys just dug up from some other report. This is data that you received from the industry directly through this Frac Focus website. Do you so where are these chemicals being used in oil and gas production, and are they being used in Pennsylvania? Do we know?
Well, we know that they've been using something like over 1,000 different gas wells across the country. And we also believe they've been used in Pennsylvania. Uh, Actually, the discovery of these chemicals was not as straightforward as looking at the Frac Focus database. We had to get a Freedom of Information Act, I guess, from the EPA, and they revealed that there were some chemicals. The generic name were like fluoro. I have I forgot the exact fluoroalkyl compounds or something like this, which doesn't actually say PFAS per se, but actually, if you learn more about these fluoroalkyl acrylic alkyl compounds, you discover that they break down into PFAS. And many experts that we interviewed as part of this article, when they were told about this generic compound, realized that this is actually a precursor to PFAS, and that's part of the reason why we know this actually is contaminating much of the water. Uh, you might want to ask, why is it that we even need to put this type of these chemicals into the fracking process? And the reason is because when they actually try to drill a mile deep into the ground and they push sand and water through the pipes through the fracking well, it actually starts to slow down because of friction. And so they have to try to create what they call slick water, which is to make the water itself so frictionless that they can actually go down a mile into the ground and actually frack the wells or break open the shale. And so they add all kinds of things like diesel oil and benzene. And now not surprisingly, a Teflon type product, PFAS, is also now being added to this slick, to make the slick water, which is, of course, then contaminating the ground. So now we learn about this and we know that they're forever chemicals. And we have to ask ourselves what's going to happen to not only ourselves, but future generations when we know that these chemicals are in the ground forever and potentially could contaminate the groundwater for forever, from what we know.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a long-winded comment, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think it's such an important part of this conversation. And the reports that you and as well as NRDC put out last week and this week, this month, this been a big month on fracking waste in general. And we do have a question from an audience member. If research on these chemicals were subsidized by the public, and if they are part of what is considered proprietary, wouldn't the public have the right to the linked information? So basically, should the public have the right to this information and it be widespread? Um, I'll add that to the to the question.
Well, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but yes, absolutely. We as the public have a right to know what's in our drinking water, and we should know about the toxic effects of chemicals that are introduced into the environment. In America, we have this thing called the Toxic Substance Control Act, TSCA, and it's kind of backwards if you think about how the act works. It's presumed that chemicals that are introduced are safe until proven otherwise, rather than the opposite, where we would actually investigate the toxicity of the chemicals prior to its introduction to the public. And so we kind of introduced all these fluorinated chemicals to to the public, and now we're discovering that actually, ooh, we maybe made a mistake, and now we're having to deal with literally widespread contamination in almost every drinking supply in America, and that actually is a serious problem that we are faced as a country, and it should ask, we should ask as a question, why didn't we have a right to know about what was in these chemicals prior to them being introduced and have toxicity studies done that the public could read about before they allow it to be released? So there are a lot of major questions about how we do toxic substances in our environment.
Yeah, and I think that this really ties to something that you talk a lot about, Dr. Tsou, where you talk a lot about the precautionary principle. Do you want to tell folks a little bit about what the precautionary principle is?
Well, it's what its name suggests, which is that if there are suspicions that actually a substance introduced in the environment could have harm, either through uh, the health impact or actually the contamination of the environment itself, then it is actually better not to introduce that product into the environment until we can prove that it's safe. And that precaution that we do is known as the precautionary principle. It's one that I think makes a lot of common sense if you ask the average person in America. But that is not the principle upon which we do things in this country, and that actually is one of the reasons why so much of our environment has been contaminated by these chemicals that have not been proven to be safe.
And what I thought fascinating about the report is that the EPA okayed the PFAS chemicals for oil and gas in spite of the risks. And so I know we talked a little bit about that kind of reversal of what should be. But do you have any other comments that you would like to make about that?
Well, that is actually sad, yes, because in our report we did mention that EPA knew that this was going to be like a PFAS or PFOA type compound, which has known health impacts, and they still approved it. Which much of this fracking process was actually developed during the Bush Cheney years, and they had a secret committee to talk about energy policy in this country, which in advance of actually introducing fracking, they had Congress pass all kinds of laws that would exempt fracking from things like the Superfund site, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Air Act, all these other environmental protections that have been given but have been exempted for the fracking process. And it's because of that exemption that we have allowed so much of these what we believe to be harmful processes to persist in our society.
Yeah, and I think that that is known as the Halliburton Loophole, if I recall correctly, where these chemicals are known or because of that loophole are allowed to be considered proprietary chemical mixes, and so the industry doesn't have to divulge all of the chemicals that they're using. And I will say, I think that this is the next part of the conversation with the NRDC report kind of goes along with, for folks that don't know, just for a little bit of background, when you're dealing with fracking waste, you're dealing with not only the stuff that's going into the hole, for a lack of better words, things that are introduced into the environment like chemicals, the water, sand, and the immense pressure that's used to fracture the rock beneath our very far beneath our feet. But then you also have this mix of stuff that lives in that shale rock that's actually coming up from the shale rock, and some of those compounds, heavy metals, radioactivity, and heavy salts, lots of salts, because this shale formation is an ancient seabed. So that's what the waste contains. It contains chemicals, known carcinogens, and then things that we don't really know. Or some of it is coming to light, and some of it came to light last week in this NRDC report, which I think is really an important part of this conversation. And so, Amy, what are some things that you wanted to mention? I love the name, by the way, a hot fracking mess, because I really think that this just really tells the tale of what we need to think about when talking about oil and gas waste. So what are some things that maybe you all discovered or came into the conversation when you were writing this report?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here and part of this conversation. It's funny because sometimes it's really hard to come up with catchy report names, and this one just was immediate. It just was obvious. So I'm glad that you appreciate it. One of the things I wanted to mention is Dr. Tsou was explaining why disclosure is so important for the chemicals that are used in the fracking process, is that, as many of y'all know, fracking can occur very close to where people live or to their water sources or their water wells. It's not like other industries where they have to stay in areas that are zoned industrial. It can be in residential areas, it can be near a school, it can be near a hospital. So it's really important that we do have that disclosure and that the public does understand what all the risks are, because it can really affect their quality of life day to day. And the other thing that Dr. Tsou mentioned is these exemptions in federal laws. And that's something that we really looked at in our report. Really, the fact that there's radioactive material in oil and gas waste is not really new information from our report. Actually, we've known about this for more than 30 years. The New York Times had a front page story in 1990 about radioactive dangers in oil field waste across the country. And the folks who live near these facilities have always known that there are concerns about them. But because of the way the federal regulatory structure has evolved over time, the industry has gotten special treatment, either exemptions from laws, loopholes, gaps, whatever we want to call them. And so the waste that's generated, not only from the fracking process, but also from the drilling process, which uses chemicals as well, and then the production throughout the life of a well, it's typically generating, whether it's oil or gas, what's called produced water, might be called brine, depending on where you're living, or salt water. That can also have radioactive material and other toxic elements in it. So we're concerned about the whole process from drilling through production. And what's in the waste has not always been known because there have been these exemptions and loopholes. And what typically happens is that if there's a loophole and a company doesn't have to comply with a certain standard that maybe other industries do have to comply with, then typically regulators are not collecting data because there's no need to prove that a company is complying with a rule. And so if we don't have data from regulation, we often don't have the information that's needed by communities to understand what their risks are, whether they're safe, or whether more protections need to be implemented. So we had concerns about, what are these federal exemptions that might apply to radioactive materials and waste from oil and gas exploration and production. And that's one of the things we did in the report, was go through not only the Safe Drinking Water Act, a law called RCRA, which stands for the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, which is a federal law that governs how waste is managed in the country, but also the Atomic Energy Act, which should apply to nuclear waste, but has some carve-outs that make sure that it doesn't apply to oil and gas waste. So oil and gas waste really kind of falls through all these cracks. Another thing that we did in the report is look at, okay, well then what are states doing? Because a lot of times what we hear is, okay, so the federal government might not have a law that addresses this, but the states are the primary regulators of oil and gas activities. And so they should be covering it. But when we looked at several key types of regulations at the state level, we found that a lot of states don't have strong enough regulations either for oil and gas waste. And it might be how they regulate landfills. It might be whether or not they allow waste to be buried on a well pad, which is allowed in some states. And sometimes that well pad is on someone's private property. And we also looked at state rules that apply to whether or not produced water or brine can be spread on roads for de-icing or dust suppression, or whether drilling waste can be spread on roads to help build and maintain those roads. And we found that the states have a lot of gaps as well. And there's been a lot of great research over the last 5 to 10 years from scientists, academic experts, looking at what are some of the radioactive materials that are in these wastes and how do they get into the environment. And so we know that the radioactive materials are there, they are getting into the environment. We don't necessarily have enough data to understand the full risk to human health yet. But it's something where we think that both state and federal agencies need to be paying a lot more attention to ensure that the public really is protected from the dangers.
Yeah, and I know that there are, there are regulations when it comes to, cradle to grave kind of reporting of radioactive material, but that's not really the case with the oil and gas industry. Is that right?
That's exactly right. If you were in the nuclear energy industry, you'd be abiding by different rules. And sometimes the oil and gas waste might have smaller amounts, but it might accumulate more over time. If you think of a truck driver who's driving waste around, maybe used frac fluid or produced water tanks, something like that, they might be exposed to smaller amounts than, say, that somebody who's working at a nuclear waste facility, but it might be on a more frequent basis. And that's the kind of thing that needs to be taken into account with our rules that we feel really isn't addressed right now.
Right. Yeah. And we do have a question from the audience, but I do want to mention, you were talking about these well pads in communities. I can tell you right now that in Penn Township, where our office is, and right next door to where I reside, in fact, half-mile from my home, there are 12 well pads currently being proposed in our community. So that's all, and that's just pads, and you can have anywhere from 5 to 20 wells per pad. So we're talking about a ton, lots and lots of waste. When I say a ton, that's like, there's like tons and tons of waste per well. And we're talking about hundreds and hundreds. And that's just in my community. That's just in Penn Township. Think about the entire state. Think about the tri-state region. And so I think that that's an important point that you mentioned, Amy, that we need to think about the amount, the quantity of waste that this industry is producing. and we just don't know what's in it. We don't know where it's going. And so it's just a huge issue that people need to wake up and think about. So I'm so glad you guys are here today to talk about it. We have a question from the chat. Tom asks, how significant do you think it is the DEP just announced that it will be testing for landfill leachate, landfill leachate for radium? I think that's an excellent question, Tom.
Yeah, well, I saw that announcement. Yeah, I think it was just yesterday, and I think it's a good step. It's a good step. It's not enough, but as I mentioned, we need to be collecting more data, and that's part of the data collection process. But we still need rules in place to stop any material, radioactive material or other toxic material from getting into the environment and threatening either air quality or water quality, et cetera. So it's a good first step.
Well, actually, the interesting question is, okay, let's say we discover radioactivity. What are you going to do about it? Because you're talking. The one thing we have to forget, we don't, remind ourselves enough, is that, let's say, radium 226 has a half-life of 1,600 years. So you're talking about something that will exceed your lifetime, your children's lifetime, and their next generations probably for another 20 years. So it's just, this is a disaster. And you can't really have radium sitting in the leachate in your landfill and ask yourselves, well, we found it. Now what do we do? I mean, you kind of have created like your own Fukushima, if you will, in your landfills in Pennsylvania. And we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to deal with this radium now that we discovered in the leachate? Do you close the landfill and say no more frac waste, or do we uh, bottle it up some way and try to find some Yucca Mountain type place that we can bury it in? It's a nightmare.
Well,
And
yeah.
there are some things. I mean, the long and short of it is there are some things that should be kept in the ground in the first place, and this is like Pandora's box that we've opened up and contaminated our entire environment.
Yeah, and I mean, these are questions that we ask all the time, Dr. Tsou, because there is a landfill, the Westmoreland Sanitary Landfill, right in our county, that has been accepting fracking waste for 10 years. We did some extensive some outreach about this, and we had actually we had a press conference because they're actually so the DEP helped the landfill come up with a plan to get rid of the leachate, because now they have to truck off their leachate because it was killing. They were sending it to the local POTW for treatment, and then the POTW wouldn't accept it anymore because it was ruining the plant. So now they're trucking it to Altoona, Pennsylvania. They're trucking it to Ohio. They're trucking it everywhere in people's neighborhoods. So even if you don't live in the shale fields, you're still being exposed to fracking waste, no matter where you are. If you live in this part of the United States, especially, and so we know that that leachate is toxic. We have a great lunch and learn. Mary popped up in the chat the lunch and learn we did with Justin Noble about really speaking to what Amy was talking about, where we've known this since the 70s or where we've known that this oil and gas waste it contains radioactive material. There's also a lunch and learn we had with Dr. Stoles, John Stoles from Duquesne, where he actually tested that leachate, and it was found that it had radioactive material in it. And now they're proposing to evaporate it in the air. And further expose that community. This is something we're fighting. I know it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous to think about. And it's
Well,
just,
the other thing is, I mean, the most pernicious is that they want to call it, de-icing fluid and actually spray it on our roads, which I think, you have to think about how stupid could we possibly be if we do something like that with this potential radioactivity all along the roads, contaminating our groundwater and forever making the land unusable. So I think, we have to do a lot of thinking about this. And you began the whole thing by asking about the Petroleum Institute's comments, and on one hand, they're trying to say, we try to do everything in the most safe possible way, and on the other hand, they are working with the state legislature to allow brine waste, radioactive brine, to be sprayed on our roads. How you can't be on both sides of this issue, and I think that's why things like what you're doing with Protect PT is so important.
Yeah, and Mary, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, what we're talking about here, and Dr. Tsou mentioned it. So we can go back to that slide, but if we go to the next slide, there was an article, a really great article that just came out in State Impact. We put the link down there for folks, and we can pop it in the chat as well. But Reed Fraser from State Impact really did this great article talking about the NRDC report that just came out, and so the American Petroleum Institute, as well as Marcellus Shale Coalition, chimed in and basically said the industry standard that this is perfectly safe, nothing to see here. We have very strict regulations, ongoing testing. But that doesn't really, that's not really the case, both of these reports, mention. And we have a question in the chat too. Is it appropriate for DEP to use NRC levels as thresholds for action? That's a good question. I'm not sure who can answer that. Wants to take that question.
Well, I assume that NRC levels are chosen because of its potential health harms, and that they've done testing, presumably in animals, and also retrospective studies on those who are victims of radioactive action exposure from nuclear testing. And I think based on those levels, they have tried to come up with very low, safe, supposedly safe levels of radioactivity. One could argue whether there are any really true safe levels of radioactivity, but just to give you some sense, I mean, I think the safe level for radium-226 is somewhere, in the tens of picocuries per liter, and we have found in frac water, levels that are like 6 to 8,000 picocuries per liter. So we're talking about many, many fold increases over what the NRC considers even remotely safe as a threshold for humans. And I think if it was my family, I would want the strictest level possible for what they consider safe. And yes, I think we should use something where we have a high index of suspicion about the safety of radioactivity.
Yeah. Amy, do you want to comment on that at all?
No, I agree with what Dr. Tsou said. There's a co-author on my report, Bemnet Alamayahu, and he's a PhD radiation health physicist. So he's really our expert on what are the appropriate levels for human exposure. I think the key thing is that we'd want to make sure that the NRC standards are designed for the types of exposures. So, are they designed for people who actually might live near a site or within a certain distance of a waste site or a well pad? Are they designed for workers who are exposed to the extent that oil and gas workers may be? In addition to, say, truck drivers, many workers are hauling out old pipes from wells and transporting those. There's a lot of used equipment that can be highly radioactive. It can also be cleaning out tanks, the sludges that are at the bottom of tanks. And there are different ways. So whatever the standards are, they need to be appropriate. And that's why we need more data collection as well. They need to be appropriate for the types of exposures that people would be experiencing in terms of the distance, how often during the day, that type of thing.
Yeah.
It's my understanding also that they have to have those radioactive bioshield warnings on their trucks at the time that they remove the frac water But if they transfer it to other trucks, that restriction is not needed anymore. So it is conceivable that they have then transferred it to other trucks without any biohazard warning on it and spray it on the roads or dump it anywhere they want. And that is another real problem with our waste regulations in our state.
Yeah, and go ahead, Amy.
I was just going to add one more thing about Pennsylvania that I think is really important is Pennsylvania has some rules that are different from waste from wells that have been fracked and from wells that are conventional, what we would call a conventional well, in that it was never fracked. Some of them, typically an older well, a vertical well, and not in a shale formation. And that's a real problem as well. The standards should be the same to protect people, regardless of where the origin of the waste is. It should be if there's this level of toxicity or radioactivity, then certain standards have to be in place to protect the public. So that's something that I think Pennsylvania needs to fix.
Yeah, and so we have another comment, and then I wanted to see if you have any comments on the slide that we have up here. So DEP specifically said in their release that WSL, which is the Westmoreland Sanitary Landfill, didn't meet the action threshold for radium, but we know that it is there and will continue to build up. Yeah, and while DEP is saying that, Dr. Stoles, who was on our Lunch and Learn, who actually tested the leachate as well, he has scientific evidence of the contrary, and so. It's important to note that it is building up, and it has been building up for over 10 years. And that's something that Dr. Tsou was talking about. And I just want to remind people here in Pennsylvania, we have Article 1, Section 27, our Environmental Rights Amendment. We have the right to clean air and pure water for generations yet to come. So that includes future generations. And if we're contaminating their land, we're contaminating their air, we're contaminating their water, their soil, how is this industry able to meet the requirements of the Environmental Rights Amendment? Because I see that they break our constitutional rights on a daily basis in our communities and when they're generating their waste and where they're taking their waste as well. So I popped up in the chat the Lunch and Learn. Amy, do you want to talk at all about this slide?
Sure. Well, this is a picture in North Dakota where authorities found large amounts of what are called filter socks. So they're basically filters that are used to filter out solids from wastewater, fracking waste. And they found them in a gas station, in a warehouse. They found them in various places in North Dakota with high levels of radioactivity. And the issue there turned out to be that North Dakota actually had some strict levels in place for their landfills, but because this radioactive waste would have been rejected at the landfills, instead of paying to take it to an appropriate landfill, people were dumping it illegally. And so what North Dakota did after that is they passed new rules that made it easier, that lowered the threshold that would be accepted at landfills in North Dakota to try and decrease the illegal dumping of this radioactive waste. And so the standards are now lower, but they were hoping to reduce illegal dumping, which just goes to show you that there are no easy answers here, because another thing about this industry that folks who live near it know is that we're talking about, literally in the United States, hundreds of thousands of wells, many of them in very remote areas. A lot of times when there are problems, there is a leak or a spill or something's not going right, it's only because a local resident comes across it, maybe on a hike or a hunting day or something like that. And the regulators can't keep on top of all these individual sites because there are so many of them. But that's something that should be addressed in regulation. It shouldn't just be like, throw your hands up, well, there's nothing we can do about it because they're hard to regulate. So I think this is just an example of, when there are these things happening, it's probably happening elsewhere and nobody's come across it yet. But we need stricter standards in place. And as you were saying, Jillian, cradle to grave, we need that chain of custody. And Dr. Tsou was saying also, if you switch trucks, you avoid some of the regulations. So that kind of stuff has to stop. We need that strict chain of custody to understand where this radioactive waste is going, and that it's, to the extent that it's generated and that we continue producing oil and gas, that it's being managed and ultimately stored and disposed of in places that are appropriately designed for that type of threat.
Yeah, and one big flaw that I see is RCRA, where this waste is not classified as hazardous waste. It absolutely should be classified as hazardous waste. If it has PFAS, if it has known carcinogens, which beyond PFAS, benzene, toluene, xylene, ethylbenzene, lots of other known carcinogens that cause cancer. We also know that it has radioactive material, it has heavy metals, it has high salt content. All of these things, we should be classifying this as toxic waste because it is toxic waste. Yet RCRA is responsible for us not having to classify it, or the oil and gas industry not having to classify it as toxic waste. So when you see a truck that says residual waste on it, is that residual waste? Is that waste from especially water tanks? Is that tank coming from a landfill that's carrying leachate, which happens, or several years ago has been happening past our office. We started investigating this back, I think it was 2018, because we saw these residual waste trucks full of water, and they were just dumping it right in a manhole. And we questioned it and found that it was just leachate. It's just leachate from the landfill. Well, what is in that leachate? And so a lot of reporting has been done on this. Public Herald has come out with some great reports, and Frac Tracker has a great map to go along with that. And it seems like the people that are doing the work on this are not the oil and gas industry, but the burden is shifting to the public, and the burden is shifting to organizations like your organizations, where we're the ones that are coming up with the scientific evidence. We're the ones coming up with all the information that should be publicly available, and trying to tell people how important it is to think about this issue. Yet the industry is off the hook, essentially, and the trucks are in our neighborhoods. So we, to Amy's point, where, people are hiking and seeing these things, if you see something, we always say, if you see something, say something. We just released our reporting mobile app. It's just report.protectbt.org, where you can report things that you see. And then based on what you report, whether it's, somebody dumping something in a creek, somebody, dumping trash, filter socks or something like that, you can report that. And then we also direct you, because reporting it to us does one thing. It alerts us to the problem, so we can try to investigate it. But also you must report it to the agency, because to Amy, to your point, there are so many wells and not enough regulators, not enough people actually inspecting what's going on at the site, what's going on at the landfill. So it takes an army of citizens to let the DEP know when something doesn't look right. So that's one of the reasons why we developed our mobile app. So I encourage people to use it, and report it when you see things like this. Now that you know what could potentially be in the waste, we want to find out what's in the waste. We want to find out what's in our backyards. And so we also have another question kind of regarding the chain of custody that we were talking about. Lois asks, is there a mechanism to track where decommissioned trucks delivering to landfills registering radium-226 end up? Who would know this?
It's a good question. I'm not aware of any system that does that.
Yeah, we actually tried to get some of this information, and we tried to get the truck manifests from the landfill, Westmoreland Sanitary Landfill, to see what trucks they denied because of the radioactivity. Because residents were telling us there's trucks coming in at night We don't know what these trucks are carrying. We don't know if they're being properly vetted for radioactivity or not. And so the residents are really concerned, particularly because they are already sick. So they are already having health impacts, and we're trying to study that. But that tells us that it's not just sanitary landfill. It's not just our garbage from our home. That there's oil and gas waste in there, and other stuff, and we don't know what's in there.
Yeah, but I think what there's a bigger, broader question here is that it's one thing to report it to protect PT or NRDC or PSR, but we're small and we don't have uh, the millions of dollars necessary to really regulate this industry. And in fact, we expect the Department of Health and the Department of Environmental Protection to be on the public side on this issue and to be our guardians. And one of the things that is most disappointing in Pennsylvania is when the grand jury report came out from the Attorney General last year, he basically took 270 hours of testimony from residents who discussed the failure of DOH and DEP from actually protecting the people from these fracking wastes or spraying around their properties or all kinds of other groundwater air pollution. And I think, the failure of our own state agencies to protect the public is actually one that should trouble all of us. I mean, if they're on the side of the gas industry on this issue and not on the side of the public, then we have a real serious problem. Uh, so the grand jury report really had 8 recommendations, of which none of them, a year later, have been implemented. And I think, that should trouble all of us because I think that says in some respects, there's a failure of government to actually do the work of what the people want in this country, in this state.
Yeah, and I would say the country too. The RCRA, I believe it was from 1970. RCRA, unconventional, oil and gas development didn't happen in 1970, not like it does today, and so that law has not been updated for a number of years. And actually there was an article that came out in Rolling Stone. If you want to pop to that screen, Mary, we have the link for folks to take a look at that. ExxonMobil lobbyists were talking about, they knew about the forever chemicals. They know what's in this waste. They've known, and they help craft the laws to allow them to do business as cheaply as possible. And then we as residents are the ones that are going to be at risk for this work. So I think there needs to be a federal push as well to reform RCRA. Let's reform it. Let's classify oil and gas waste for what it is: toxic and radioactive. Let's get the cradle to grave, this tracking, this chain of custody going for every single oil and gas well. And the industry says, oh, we're regulated. We have reporting. I have seen those. They're called OG71. If you look up, it's a waste management, and it's company wide. They put in their waste management report for their company when they apply for their oil and gas permits. It's called OG71. It's an authorization that the DEP requires, where they have to say how they're going to handle the waste on site, how they're going to separate the solids and liquids. One person I talked to at the DEP, when I was trying to figure out what the heck an OG71 was, like several years ago when I first saw it come up on my screen on EFAX, he said, a lot of times they will disassemble these tanks, so the water goes into holding tanks, and then the water gets shipped off by truck, but the holding tanks have all the sediment. We know that radioactivity really attaches to that sediment, and Amy, I think you mentioned earlier, we have to be testing those those tanks, and that's actually something that is required by the OG 71. They're supposed to have, based on the T-norm report, specific plan for radioactivity. Yet, if plans are not implemented or implementable because the plan is inadequate, how are they supposed to make sure that this waste is not radioactive? If, and the DEP, there is no checks and balances for the DEP to review the plan and to say, we don't think this plan is adequate. We think you should do more. We think you should consider more. We think you should test more. They could do that, but they have discretion. And a lot of times their discretion is, it creates vague, this vague issue in the law where the DEP says, well, we don't really have to do that. And if we try to do it, we're going to get litigated against. So we're just not going to do it. Does anybody have any comment on that process?
Well, one of the things I think is interesting is that there is a radiation protection committee or something that's part of the DEP, and they meet like, I don't know, every quarter or something like this. Anyway, I asked to be a speaker or a guest at one of their meetings like earlier this year, and the agenda is usually things like medical radioactive waste, like radioactive iodine and radiation substances that are brought into the hospitals for treatment. And in the discussion, I asked, well, are you guys tracking radioactivity from the fracking waste? And it was like almost a revelation. This is DEP, this is their committee. And they said, well, no, not really. And I said, well, my plea to this committee is that as part of your reporting on medical waste, that you actually also ask about the radioactivity that's coming from these fracking sites and have it be reported. Now, I don't know whether that is behind the leachate decision to actually measure radioactivity from these waste fields, but I hope I put a bug in some of the ears of the committee members, because I really think it is a huge failure on our part as a state that we have not been regularly monitoring the radioactivity that's coming out of the fracking process. I guess that's what I want to say. And it's disturbing to me that we've been fracking wells since 2005 or something in this state, and up to now we have never thought that we should actually be measuring the radioactivity that comes out of the fracking process. And as Amy said in the very beginning, the New York Times wrote articles about this back in the 1990s. I mean, it's very, very disturbing that we have ignored radioactivity as one of the potentially serious problems of the fracking process. Anyway, I could ramble on, but just stop.
Amy, do you have any comments?
Well, I just want to add that if there's a glimmer of hope, Pennsylvania does have some real champions to try and fix these issues. Representative Matt Cartwright has introduced legislation in Congress that would close that RCRA loophole that we've been talking about. And Senator Casey has introduced legislation that would close what Julian, you referenced as the Halliburton Loophole in the Safe Drinking Water Act. So they understand that there are problems with the federal laws, and we'll continue to push the Congress and federal agencies to do more. And then at the state level, there's a state legislator, Sarah Innamorato, who's introduced legislation to try and close that waste loophole at the state level. And so I think the more people can support these representatives and what they're trying to do and communicate that to our elected officials, I think that's really important. As you said, that this makes the operations for the oil and gas companies cheaper. They're very wealthy corporations. They can afford to clean up their act and do more to protect communities, and we think they should be required to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially to kind of, kind of, I forget what the term is, but to add fuel to the fire, or to really think about it more. We are subsidizing at the federal level. We're subsidizing, and at the state level, we subsidize um, this industry. The Westmoreland Sanitary Landfill received a state grant to build their leachate evaporator. Or no, I'm sorry. They received a grant to build a CNG facility. Not the leachate evaporator. I apologize. That was I misspoke. So they're getting They're getting public funds. There federal funds going into oil and gas all the time. Oil and gas subsidies, and this is a real problem because if this industry can't do this safely, then they shouldn't be able to do it. And there are other industries that could do things safely, that could be more for benefit of public good. So I think that there needs to be a wider conversation about that. And then we also do have one last question. I know we're running short on time, but we have one last question in the chat. Since our local taxes pay for refuse pickup, should we as citizens inspect our landfill's water runoff? So I think that they're asking, should there be inspection of the water runoff at landfills? And I know that there's the water runoff at landfills a lot of times goes into leachate ponds, and those leachate ponds, they're not testing for radioactivity at the leachate in the leachate ponds. I know that from talking with one of the people at the DEP when we were questioning why this leachate was going into the sewer. They said that they were not testing for radioactivity, and we have some of the DEP records for that. But what do you guys think about should citizens inspect the landfills for runoff?
Well, when
that
you
should
say,
go
go ahead,
ahead.
May. No, go ahead. I mean, this is a role where government, I mean, you as a private citizen, you don't have the money to pay for the testing of the runoff, but that's where government has a responsibility. So I'll turn it to Amy for the last
I
word.
was going to say basically the same thing. Was, yeah, absolutely, that should be part of the regulatory program and requirements for a landfill. It's a large facility, and whether it's stormwater or leachate, there should be careful attention to how that's getting off-site and potentially into groundwater or evaporating into the air.
Yeah. Well, and to keep the conversation going on fracking waste and where it goes, I'm part of a team that is working on waste barging on the Ohio River, and actually the Monongahela and Allegheny River as well. So if you live in Pittsburgh or near Pittsburgh, and you live anywhere near the river, you could be exposed to oil and gas waste, even if you don't have oil and gas in your neighborhood, just by the barging of waste. And this is a real problem because these barges can spill and leak. And there's really no oversight. We're going to talk about that a lot tomorrow night on the Better Path Presents, Wednesday at 7 p.m. We're going to talk with folks from Earth Justice and Fair Shake, folks that have really brought light to this issue. And of course, right near the Westmoreland Sanitary Landfill, there is a new terminal, or they're reusing or rebuilding part of a terminal to ship oil and gas waste from Pennsylvania into Ohio, into some of those less regulated and less states that actually are worse than Pennsylvania when it comes to regulating oil and gas and their waste. So stay tuned for that tomorrow night. You can join us by registering at the bit.ly link there. And then Mary, if you go to the last screen, and she popped a link in the chat as well. Thank you very much, Mary. We want to thank Dr. Walter Tsou and Amy Mall for joining us today. Especially since it was last minute. We had another guest that fell ill, and this is such a timely and important subject that we are so thankful that you both could be on today talking about oil and gas waste. talking about the chemicals that are in the waste from the PFAS report from Physicians for Social Responsibility. If you haven't read it yet, please do read it, as well as the NRDC report that came out of the hot fracking mess. And the radioactivity and fracking waste. So whether it's naturally occurring, materials that we're finding in the waste, or known carcinogens that are and other materials that are in this waste is bad news, and it's being shipped all over the United States and in our communities. And so we should definitely talk to our legislators and talk to our federal government to reform RCRA, to rally around champions at the state level and at the federal level that are doing something about this, like Sarah Innamorato and Senator Katie Muth, those two wonderful people really rallying around this issue to try to fix this big problem. So I want to thank you guys for being here today. If anyone has any suggestions about future Lunch and Learns, we want to give opportunities to folks to let us know and do a survey. So please do the survey. It's really important. Protect BT is funded by grants. And so we want to make sure that we're giving the public the information that they need. And so if you want to go to the Lunch and Learn survey right there on the link, you can fill out our survey, tell us what you want to hear about and what you think about our program. And so thank you so much, Dr. Tsou and Amy, for being here today. Really love this conversation, and we need to keep the conversation going in our own communities and put pressure on our legislators to do something about this toxic waste issue. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for hosting. It was fantastic.
Thank you, Jillian.
All right. Good to see you guys. We'll see you again soon.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.